So since y'all are here, I assume y'all don't really have to worry about this, but if you need to turn something into me, as in exams and stuff like that, the lab assignments, you guys kind of know how that works. If you need to do a quiz or something that you're missing, tell me by the end of this week, or I'm going to kind of do it. Okay, that's it. It's been long enough. Y'all have plenty of time. This is mostly for people. So y'all had plenty of time. Let me know by Friday or Saturday, Sunday at the very latest what you need to take, and if you don't, I will plug it in as a 0. You guys over there that aren't here. Cool? Okay. So anyway, animals. What do you guys know about animals? We're going to talk about animals today that don't have backbones. What do you guys call those? Invertebrates, right? So in means without, so vertebrates are things with, and in means things without. So things without a vertebrate. So my least favorite concept on the planet, taxonomy. Who is related to who? Really useful, but depends on whom you ask. So there are some biologists that swear by taxonomy, and then there are some like myself who kind of think it's cool, but not really that useful. Because things like bacteria change their taxonomic labels all the time. So what I've realized, what I've learned 4 or 5 years ago is not the same for some species anymore. They're not related to who they used to be, because now we have DNA and things like that. They used to just base it on what your body structure was look like. How long were your arms compared to that other species? And that's how we based, and how many teeth you got, how fast do you develop, blah, blah, blah. And that's how we compare who was related to who. Now, we can go in and go, now your DNA says you're 99.9% similar to that species, so now you are related even though you don't look anything at all. Right, does it make sense? So now we're kind of rewriting a lot of this stuff. So kind of a fluid thing. So some people really like it, some people really don't. I kind of think it's kind of useless, but you know, it is what it is. Let's talk about it for just a second. It's useful for species that are well established. Things like us. Make sense? We know what we are. We've classified humans. We know what species of humans are, who they're related to. But things like bacteria that change all the time, things that are microscopic we have a hard time seeing, it's a little less useful. Make sense? Things that have been around for a long time, like elephants, we know who they're related to. Anyway, so you guys have probably seen this before, right? This is Danish kings play cards on fat green stools. This is the acronym to remember this. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So, domain. The farther you are at the top, the less inclusive, or the more inclusive you are. If you are a living organism, you are considered in a domain. Make sense? There are 3 of them. One of them includes eukaryotic cells, the other one includes prokaryotic cells, and the other one includes archaic cells. Make sense? So there are 3 of them. You're either one of those 3 critters. Make sense? Down below that we have kingdom, and that's going to be animals, plants, bacteria, things like that. So a little less, or a little more inclusive, a little less stuff inside of it, but still pretty broad. You're an animal, a plant, makes sense, guys? So the farther you get down into phylum, class, order, family, it's kind of like saying your great-great-great-great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, your great, and makes sense, guys, until you get eventually down to you. And there's only one of you. But there are 2 of your parents that are related similarly to you, and 4 of your grandparents, and 16, so on and so forth. Make sense? Only one species. And species is something that we know independently by itself is something that's capable of reproducing and producing fertile offspring with an organism that's identical to it. Make sense? So you have a baby that's identical to another human, and so do I, and so do you, and everybody else. Since we don't have other species babies. Make sense how that works? Pretty cool? So, species is a well-established thing that when reproduction occurs, repeats itself over and over and over and over identically. Doesn't change. Pretty easy on that? You guys get the concept. Dogs produce dog babies. Make sense? But there are weird ones out there, like mules. They're kind of half horse, half donkey. What are they? Make sense? They can't make fertile babies, so they don't count. Make sense? You got to be able to reproduce. Your baby's got to be able to reproduce too. Make sense? If your babies can't have babies, useless for evolution. Doesn't matter. Might as well just not have had a baby at all. Make sense for that? It's useless. It can't reproduce. Cool. So your baby's got to be able to have babies. So things like horses and donkeys, even though they can have babies, their babies can't have babies, so they're 2 separate species. Simple so far? Pretty easy. Okay. Kind of get the idea here. The more of these you have in common, the more closely that you are related to something. A wolf is Canis Lupus. You guys ever heard that before for a wolf? The scientific name of a wolf? All that stuff, animals, blah, 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 down into here, down into carnivora, things that are carnivores, and then you get into Canis, would be its genus. That's all the dogs. Makes sense? Every single dog on the planet, foxes, wolves, domestic dogs, wild dogs, things like that. Things that are considered canis. Make sense? Canines. Canine. And then you get in down into here where the species is Lupus. It's a canine, a lot of those, but we know which specific canine we're talking about because it is a wolf. Canis lupus. Makes sense? There's no other lupus on the planet, it's a wolf. But there is, however, a Canis familiaris, which is a dog. Common dog that we have at home. Make sense? His genus is the same, Canis, but his species is different. There's only one dog, only one wolf, gray wolf or whatever. But they're very, very, very closely related. Make sense, guys? Because they share a great grandparent. Make sense? Our grandparent. So far, the more of these you got in common with something else, the more closely you are related to it. We are not carnivores, we are omnivores. So our extent of relationship with dogs ends about right there. Order Carnivora. We are not carnivores. So we are animals, yeah, and we're mammals, but that's about the extent we have in common with dogs. Makes sense, guys? The more of these you have in common, the more closely you are related to something else. Keep going how that works? Awesome. Little brief rundown of taxonomy. Changes quite often. Each species has a unique name made up of 2 unique names. I've used them before. Canis lupus, Homo sapien, things like that. Make sense? Scientific names, very, very important because not everybody speaks English. Not everybody uses the same names for animals. What do y'all call killer whales? Orcas, right? Lots of different names for those. They call them black and white whales up in Alaska. Different names for it. You guys wouldn't know what those were if you didn't know all the common names. And then what if somebody refers to you by its Russian name or its Chinese name or something? You are going to be totally lost. But if you use the word orcus, no matter what language you speak, you're going to know what you're talking about. Make sense? And that's why scientific names exist. Cool in that it eliminates the problems of well, I'm talking about a robin. Well, there's lots of different species of robins, and the ones in Europe are called European robins, and the ones in the United States are called American robins, and they're not related at all. They're just birds. It's about the most they got in common. Makes sense? So, eliminates problems when you use specific names, like Homo sapien or Erythricus rubelicus, which is the scientific name for the European robin. Makes sense? Cool. And the American one is Turdus migratoris. Nothing in common. Turdus erythricus. Totally different names. No commonalities. Sense on that? Just birds. Cool so far? Alright. So, we're going to talk about animals. What is an animal? You guys are probably good at telling me what an animal is, right? Probably pick out an animal out of a lineup if I ask you to do so from a plant, right? All animals are eukaryotic. You guys know what that means, right? Most complex cell type. They have all those organelles inside of them, mitochondria, all that fancy stuff, no cell walls. You guys remember all that goodies? You guys probably watch the lectures, which is why you come to class. So you guys know what I'm talking about, right? At least I hope so. No cell walls, all that good stuff. They are multicellular. Animals, cells, and animals in general are multicellular. That's what differentiates us from protists. Cool? You might have a protist that has everything in common with an animal cell, but it's unicellular. Make sense? That's the difference. Remember I told you I don't like protists? That's kind of why. But the difference there is they're all unicellular, we're all multicellular. No animal on the planet exists as a single-celled organism. Make sense? There's just not one that exists. You're either something else or not an animal. Every single animal on the planet makes food from the environment that cannot make its own food. Has to eat food from the environment. Nobody that's an animal can make their own food. That's one of our key characteristics. We got to eat something else to get our energy. Make sense? There are very, very, very limited few exceptions for that. And they can't do it forever, and we'll talk about there when we get there. Cool? Very odd conceptions about the work. And we get our food by eating stuff. You guys are familiar with that, right? We ingest things. We break it down either inside or outside and suck in the nutrients of what we need, and we bring it in and then break it down inside of our bodies further and get the nutrients out. Cool? Differentiates us from fungus because they have cells in common with us. They're eukaryotic. They're all multicellular for the most part. Lots of unicellular ones, but they don't eat food on the inside. They eat it on the outside. Make sense? So all of those goodies. So this is the phylogeny of animals, the animal tree of life, if you like. Up at the top, we have our very simple animals, things like sponges. Bet you guys didn't really think of sponges as animals, did you? SpongeBob's a good representation of what a sponge is. It's an animal. Kind of looks more like a plant, doesn't it? But it's not. And then at the bottom, we have more complicated animals, highly evolved animals, if you like, things with backbones. Since things considered chordates, so we'll talk about. We'll go to right here tonight. And then these guys get their own full thing because they're a whole lot more cool and a whole lot more complicated. What's far? Fairly easy. At the top, we have evolutionarily ancient organisms, things that have been around forever. We find their skeletons and their fossils at the beginning of when life shows up on the planet after it goes through its prokaryotic to eukaryotic transitions. Makes sense? We find billions of sponge fossils, so not billions of them, they're kind of rare, but we do find lots of sponge fossils, and that's basically it for a really long time. Make sense? And then you start to see a little more complexity where sponges turn into, or start to evolve a little bit into some sort of tentacly little critters. Basically just a sponge with a tentacle. Not a whole lot more fancy. Makes sense, guys? And then things kind of pick up from there. You can kind of see, as we'll talk about this a little more, the transition as things go up. Cool? And I'll show you guys some cool things, or talk about some cool things that you probably don't think about exist. And I didn't either up until I started really digging into evolutionary theory that's actually really cool. Ready? Alright, so at the very beginning, you have to realize how animals are put together. And animals that are very simple don't have any body structure. Since body structure is an important thing for evolution. Are you going to have repeating body structures, like a worm? You guys have seen a worm, like little segments in it, right? Every single one of those little segments basically a same carbon copy of other little segments. Are you going to have independent segments, like a bug has a head section, a midsection, and a thorax? Are you going to have one big section, like us? Since, guys, it kind of really depends on it. And the other big deal is how the organism's body's put together. Is it put together symmetrically, like ours, 2 carbon copies, one on either side? Or is it random? Does it just blob out like a sponge? Make sense? You can't cut a sponge in half and get 2 equal sides. This is never going to happen. They just grow. Make sense? They don't have any symmetry. Is it something like a starfish, where it's a nice circle, and anywhere you cut it, as long as you go through the middle in a straight line, you're going to get 2 equal halves? Make sense? So far, which one of those is it? You guys can kind of get the idea here. So radially symmetric organisms tend to be a little more evolutionarily simple. And since it works like a wheel. You got a wheel in the middle, and as long as you go through the center of the wheel with a straight line, you get 2 equal halves. Makes sense, guys? You understand the concept of cutting a pizza or cutting a pie in half. Makes sense? As long as you go through the middle, you get 2 equal halves. Both halves are carbon copies of one another. Cool on that one? That tends to be very little more simple than things like us that are bilaterally symmetrical. Our 2 halves are either side. Make sense? You can only cut me in half right here. You can cut those guys in half anywhere you want as long as you go through the middle. You can only cut me one direction to get 2 identical halves. Either here or here, it's not going to work. And this way definitely is not going to work. Make sense? Just one. Things that are bilaterally symmetrical tend to be a little more evolutionarily complex. Things without symmetry at all, there's very little complexity and evolutionary history there with them. Those things have been around forever. Things like sponges, makes sense? They got no asymmetrical body plan, they just grow. They've been around forever. You see radially symmetric animals start to evolve. They exist for a long time. And then you start to see bilaterally symmetrical animals start to evolve. Make sense? Real good question. I'm just going to go ahead and preempt this. You guys have probably heard this phrased as, if monkeys turned into humans, why are there still monkeys, right? You guys probably heard that question before? Well, for one, we didn't evolve from monkeys, so that right there tells you the person that asked that question doesn't know what they're talking about. And 2, where did the people that founded this country come from? England, right? Why are there still people in England? Because they didn't all come here. Not every single ancestor that was shared between humans and monkeys needed to evolve. Make sense, guys? They lived in a perfectly fine environment for them. They live in the trees. They eat food. They have lots of food, lots of trees. Their environment doesn't change. Why do they need to evolve? Why do they need to change when they work perfectly fine there? Evolution is only driven by changing environments. Make sense, guys? Our ancestors, their environment changed, which is what drove us to become different, to adapt to our environment. Their ancestors didn't. Their environment stayed the same. They didn't need to evolve. Make sense, guys? Basically, that's how that works. There was no need, no driving force for it. But as evolution continues, things get different and different. Animals expand more across the globe. It's all driven by food. Make sense, guys? That's basically what drives evolution. Competition for resources. There's a lot of us in this room. You guys are all sharing the same food source as me, right? Basically. But if I can somehow evolve to live right here, you guys can't do that. I get a whole lot more food that you guys can't get. Make sense? That's what drives evolution. It's just pushing away from the center to get more resources. Make sense, guys? And the farther you get away from the center of the evolutionary kind of where it kind of all started, where life kind of began thing, the more complex you get. Make sense, guys? In the center, it's still the same. You guys are still eating the same food you were eating billions of years ago. Why y'all need to change? I'm so far away that I don't have any single idea what y'all are eating, and I got something different way over there, and it's been billions of years. Make sense? That's basically how that works. Anyway, cool so far in this concept? If I give you a picture of a butterfly, could you tell me if it's radially or bilaterally symmetric? Butterfly, cut a butterfly in half. Right there. It's bilaterally symmetric. Cool. sort of important for you guys, but a little more complex than you guys need. How the inside of an animal is put together is a big deal too. Cool, evolutionarily speaking. Critters that have no inside of their bodies are kind of not a big deal. Makes sense, guys? Those are evolutionarily really simple. What they have is they have one big hole. Make sense? They have one mouth, one stomach, and one anus. And it's essentially one giant cavity. Make sense, guys? They work kind of like this. Stuff comes in, it's digested, it goes right back in. Sounds like a real pleasant way to live, right? You guys want to be that kind of animal? It's like a jellyfish. Make sense on that? Then you get one little step up where you get some internal organs and some separation from stuff. Make sense? Stuff you digest is gross. Stuff you eat is gross. Full of bacteria and nasty from the outside, right? We want to keep all that stuff separated from our internal organs. Our internal organs are nice and sterile. We don't want to get those nasty. Make sense, guys? We want to keep everything separated. So as this process started to get a little more complex, organisms started to evolve more, eat different food sources and things that weren't so easily broken down like this. You needed to start separating them off. Make sense? So the first thing that sort of evolved was something like this. So if you cut me in half this way, and you look down like this, make sense? This is what you'd see. Something similar to this. All the internal organs are kind of smushed out in here, and the food goes right through the middle. Makes sense, guys? Not a whole lot of separation, but it's sort of separated a little bit. It's sometimes called a tube within a tube. Makes sense? So food goes right through the middle, from one side to the other, in and out. And it's separated from all the internal organs. That's kind of a big deal. Makes sense, guys? That's important, because if you eat something complex or something that's toxic here, you're gonna die. Makes sense? It goes in, it's digested, your entire body gets it, you're gonna die instantaneously. But over here, it might not leach out into your stomach or into your internal organs. You might just have a bad tummy ache for a little while if you're a worm or whatever. Makes sense? You might have problems eating, digesting, but it might not kill you. And it might also allow you the ability to eat something different that guy can't eat. Make sense? And then what it allows you to do is also section off your digestive system. That's kind of cool, right? I can keep all my enzymes that digest junk in one tube instead of just floating around in my whole body. And that's kind of a big deal too, right? I don't want my digestive enzymes flashing around on my heart and my lungs and stuff. Make sense? That would not be fun. So if I can keep them all in one little spot, it's even better. Make sense? Cool. And then we take a step up. Those things are called Acelamates. Coelom is the middle. Make sense, guys? These guys don't have one. Acelamates. Pseudo, sort of almost there. And then we have us, where you have this. Our internal organs are completely separated in their own compartments from the digestive enzymes and also from the rest of the stuff on the inside of our body. Anybody ever seen them do surgery? There's a sac that surrounds your entire internal organs. And since, guys, it sits right underneath it. And now the fluid stuff floats around and your internal organs are there. Your digestive tract sits through the middle of it and nothing ever touches each other. They're all nicely separated off. Makes sense? Nice compartmentalized, segmented. You do this, you do that, you do this, you're digestive, you're respiratory, you're that, everything's separated off. Nothing's going to get cross-contaminated and gross and messed up with each other. These guys are sort of good at it, can't do anything. Make sense of how that works? That's our little evolutionarily step up the ladder from getting, I eat and poop out of the same hole, and if I eat something bad, I'm going to die, to us, where we have separate holes for every single thing, and every single thing in the middle is separated off into its own little process, and they don't talk to each other very much. Cool. Pretty neat how that works. And you can watch this basically in the fossil record. Very nice little transition. Make sense? Cool. So, Acelamates, pseudocoelamates, coelamates. Basically, that's all I want you guys to realize is that there's 3 different types. Cool. Awesome. Okay. Kind of makes sense how this works. Nothing over there, tube within a tube kind of thing, and then everybody separated out in their own little cavities. Cool. It has to do with how many tissue levels you got inside of it. We're not going into deep. Alright. Y'all ready to start with actual animals, talking about some fun stuff? Alright, so animals. At the very, very, very beginning, we have animals without backbones. And that makes sense if you think about it. Animals needed to evolve bones. Those are complex structures, right? Plants don't have bones, bacteria don't have bones, and those evolved long before us. So before you gotta get bones, you gotta have critters that don't have bones, right? That's basically what we went through pretty much up until we went to about, here. Animals that don't have bones. So, animals without backbones are an even farther step down than animals without bones. Makes sense? If you have a backbone, you have a nice rigid structure where you can put stuff to move. Makes sense? If you guys have ever used a winch on a truck, you gotta have the trucks there with the winch on it to pull something out of. Makes sense? You can't just put a winch on the ground, because if you do, it's just gonna get yanked towards whatever's stuck. Makes sense? You gotta have something heavy to pull it with. Makes sense? And that's what our backbone does. It's the anchor point for our muscles. Makes sense? I can pull against my backbone, and that is what allows me to get force into things. Makes sense? An anchor point for your arms, anchor points for muscles, skeletons, and things like that. Backbone. It's really important. Cool? That's why you want one. If you don't have one of those, you can flop around anywhere you want to, and you kind of twist it inside out of yourself. And that's basically what it is. Kind of cool. Something like an eel. Makes sense, guys? Cool. Or a hagfish, I should say, not an eel. But you guys get the idea? Cool. So let's talk about our sponges. So sponges, you guys think of as stationary animals, right? They're stuck on the ground. Most of you guys thought they were probably plants, but they're not. But sponges, it's not actually true. They're not stationary. They're stationary for the vast majority of their life, but one characteristic of animals is they have to be able to move. Make sense? And sponges, I bet you guys didn't know this, can move when they're babies. Sponges also reproduce by sperm and eggs. Super weird. Sponges are filter feeders. You guys know that, right? They basically just have a big hole and they filter stuff. Water goes in and then water goes right back out. Basically like that. Water goes in, water goes out. All the nutrients that go in get filtered out, and then nutrient-free water gets spit out the other side. Make sense? Female sponges. Female, they're hermaphrodites. Make sense? Will produce an egg in the bottom of their sponge. Make sense? They will filter out some sperm from the water that the male sponges, release. And then it goes down inside and fertilizes and develops into a little baby sponge. Cool? That little baby sponge looks kind of like a fuzzy football. And it's microscopic. Swims around in the environment, and it's going to go land somewhere and grow into a new sponge. And that's how sponges work. Kind of cool, right? Sponges can also reproduce asexually. If you go cut a piece off of a sponge, or if it breaks a piece off of it, like just naturally speaking, and that broken piece of the sponge lands somewhere that's nutrient help, or that's a good environment, it can grow into a brand new sponge from there. Make sense? That's called fragmentation or budding. Make sense? SpongeBob does that in a couple of those episodes. You got swinging buds, the little ones. So, cool. Very strange how these guys work. You can't do that, obviously. Make sense? If you cut a sponge in half, it'll grow back the piece it's broken with. Make sense? It's basically kind of grows back. Pretty cool, right? That's evolutionarily really old and really simple. Make sense? We can't do that, unfortunately. You'd think we could. We'd be the best animals evolution could produce. Grow back arms, right? That's really simple, old evolutionary stuff that tends to be shed really fast as evolution gets better. Make sense? We don't do that. Old critters do that, have regenerative abilities. That works really well. When you guys chop off the tail of a lizard, it doesn't grow back bones in the lizard. It grows back cartilage. Make sense? So its tail doesn't grow back fully functional. Even they can't do it 100% well. Make sense? So, these guys do it perfectly. Because basically all they are is a bunch of animal cells living together in a big blob. Make sense? I don't really need you, but it's nice to have you. I don't really need you, but it's nice to have you. And we just kind of hold hands and kind of form a big blob. And that's why there's no shape to sponges. Make sense, guys? Because they're just blobs of cells living together. Cool on that? And that's why if you break part of it off, it can grow another sponge. Because there's really no compartmentalization in there. It's got no reproductive system. It's got no, brain. It's just one cell that basically lives with a bunch of other cells that all work together to make one sponge, but they don't really need anybody else. Weird little critters, right? Can you guys see how that's evolutionarily really old? How that's not very fancy? Nothing really there. It's just kind of people working together, sort of, kind of ish. Make sense on that? They have no tissues whatsoever. They don't have nervous tissue. They don't have, you guys should have got that through lecture. They don't have muscle tissue. They don't have organ tissue. They don't have any of that stuff. Make sense, guys? It exists solely at the cellular level. Blob of cells living together. Cool. All right. They filter water through the environment. I mentioned that. They bring water in. Cool. This is how they filter feed. This thing here is called a choanocyte or a collar cell. These things line the inside of the sponge. You guys see that? Cool. So water is sucked in from the outside. Water is filtered up and pushed through the inside of the sponge. This little guy here, you guys see the little flagellum that pokes out, right? This little collar here is full of sticky snot. Cool so far? This little column here is going to spin, or the flagellum, it's going to spin. And all of those flagella spinning in the same direction is going to be what creates a water current. And this guy essentially has a little propeller inside of it that sucks water in from the outside. Kind of neat, right? So it sucks water in from the outside, and then it pushes it out called the osculum outside through the top. Cool. Sucks it in from the outside, pushes it right through the outside of the top of the sponge. Cool enough? Well, as it sucks the water up, this little collar here is covered in sticky goo. All the little nutrients, all the little goodies and stuff that be floating in the water is going to get stuck inside of this little collar cell. Makes sense? It's going to get stuck to it. Cool? And then all the little goodies and nutrients are going to be slowly pulled down inside of this cell, the choanocyte cell, collar cell, and it's going to be digested. Make sense? And that's how the sponge eats. Not very fancy, huh? Kind of neat though. Cool. You can take this little cell off, break it off, and go make another sponge. Make sense? You guys have all seen rebar in concrete before, at least I hope so, where they make a little rebar frame, the little metal inside of concrete. They make the little metal frame, and then they pour the concrete around it. You guys know what I'm talking about? You got to have the metal to hold the concrete up, and you got to have the concrete to hold the rebar up, or to give streets to it. Make sense? Sponges work the same way. If you just had the sponge cells, the concrete, this concrete wouldn't be able to stick anywhere. It'd just fall off. Make sense? These guys have a skeleton. I bet you guys didn't think of sponges having a skeleton, did you? But if you've ever crushed a real bass sponge, it's kind of scratchy. Make sense? You guys have ever felt that? They're sort of scratchy. They have skeletons inside of them called spicules. And it's basically kind of like little jacks sort of things. Depends, different species have different shaped ones. And the cells will sit in them. Make sense? And it's like scaffolding. It lines up and makes a little shape for the sponge, and then all the little sponge cells just fill in the little shapes, fill in the little holes. Kind of cool, right? So it's kind of neat. Made out of calcium carbonate. You guys remember we talked about acid rain sucking the calcium carbonate out of the water for coral? Same thing for these. Makes them hard for them to make their spicules. Make sense? So sponges are by that cool too. Pretty cool, right? I actually think sponges are cool. They're kind of neat. It's interesting to think about how they work. Cool. Nothing fancy here. Basically a bunch of blobs of cells living together in a big conglomerate together. Cool. Very little fanciness going on here. Cool so far? Okay. Take a step up our evolutionary ladder from blobs of cells living together to blobs of cells living together but as one kind of functioning organism. Make sense? On to things called jellyfish. Make sense? Jellyfish exist. They're about the first thing to show up on the fossil record other than our sponges. Cool? And they're basically really hard to find because they don't have bones, they don't have any hard tissues on them. So fossilizing a jellyfish is something that's kind of rare to occur. Makes sense? There's nothing hard for them to fossilize. So you have to get really lucky to find fossil jellyfish. But we do. And a jellyfish is basically a sponge with some tentacles in it that has the ability to move around. Make sense? Remember our sponge has one hole that eats this way? Same water comes in and out. Let's flip this upside down. Oh, I can't draw that upside down. Let me try that again. That's actually a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. And let's add a little shape to it this way, and some tentacles. And that's a jellyfish. Make sense? It's basically an upside down single sponge cell. Cool. Or it's a bunch of cells put together, but basically it's an upside down sponge. Some tentacles. Cool. Except it exists at a slightly higher evolutionary ladder because it has nerves. Makes sense, guys? We're getting slightly better. It's got something called a nerve net. It can slightly feel. If you poke it over here, it'll know over there what's going on. That's about all it does. These cells can talk to each other, whereas the sponge cells kind of exist separately from one another. Basically it. Makes sense? The jellyfish is going to not filter feed for the most part, but prey on things. Cool. Things are going to float around in the environment and stick to them. It's going to bump into its little tentacles, and it will kill it. We'll talk about that, how it does that in a second. Bring it inside. It's going to be digested up in here, and the waste is going to be spent right back out the same hole. Make sense? They reproduce the exact same way as our sponge does. The sperm swims up, fertilizes the egg on the inside, the little baby is then spat out, and then it goes on. This is how that works. Cool. Have another form of reproduction we'll talk about in a second. So far on this? one step up from sponges because these guys have radially symmetric body plans. They're round. Make sense? Our sponges have no symmetry. These guys are round. You cut them in half anywhere you want to, as long as it's the middle, and you get a half a jellyfish. Make sense? So they got some sort of body symmetry, just not a whole lot. Pretty cool so far? Okay. Anybody here ever been stung by a jellyfish? Not so fun, right? Yeah, very, very unpleasant. So let's talk about how this works. So inside of their little tentacles, they have stinging cells called cnidocytes. I think there's a picture of it on this slide, but it's not all right for it. Yeah, they're there. Here. So basically you can see this as a sponge. Make sense, guys? So you guys remember all the little collar cells and all that stuff? Basically it's the exact same thing. Cool, except we got some tentacles at the bottom of it. Cool, it's to help it acquire prey. If you have to rely on filter food, if the environment gets not so rich in nutrients, you're gonna starve to death. Make sense? If you can hunt for food, even if you can't really move around a whole lot, if you get stuck to the ground, there are quite a few stationary jellyfish, and we'll talk about those in a second, that can't swim. If you can hunt for food, even if you can't move, you got an evolutionary advantage. Makes sense, guys? And that's why these things evolve. Cool, it's just getting more food than somebody else. Cool, evolution's not complex, there's nothing fancy about it. Cool. So inside of their little bodies basically is a sponge with some tentacles at the top. And at the top, where the tentacles exist, they have these little stinging cells called cnidocytes. And this is where the subphylum gets its name, Cnidarians. Cool. So cnidocytes looks like this. And on the top of it is this little tiny thing called a trigger. And if you've ever seen the tentacles of a jellyfish, they sit right along the outside of the tentacles. They're all along the side. Make sense? Cool, they just line the tentacles. And the entire outside of the tentacles, right outside the tentacles sits this little tiny hair that's about that far out. Make sense? And they float underneath the jellyfish. Or in this case, they floated in the air from the jellyfish being stuck to the ground. Cool. You touch them. You trip that little trigger there, and what's going to happen is inside of it is this little spring-loaded barb. Make sense? The little spring-loaded barb is going to instantaneously fire through the cell, fire into your skin. All those little tiny barbs are going to poke out. What are those little barbs for? Same concept of a fish hook. So you can't get away. Make sense? Put the straight barb, you can slide right back out. But if you got a barb with a hook in it, you can't. And that's why those things are there, to hook in. Make sense? So they have billions of these all over their tentacles. You brush up against it, you're probably going to get 20 or 30, 40 of those things stuck inside of you, and the jellyfish has got a good hold on you. Make sense? Not only are they going to grab a hold of you that way, this little filament at the bottom of it has a hole in it, and it's going to inject some toxins inside of you. Make sense? And that's why it hurts so dang bad. On top of just getting stung, which hurts, it injects some toxins inside of you. Not all of them do, but some of them have really, really, really bad venom that's very lethal, and some of them have just kind of irritant. Makes sense? It just depends on the species. Cool. That's how these things work. Pleasant, right? So jellyfish are not the most fun things on the planet, but a slightly more complex sponge with the ability to hunt. But basically it's just a sponge that's upside down. Cool? One more cool thing about these guys is jellyfish are immortal. We talked about this last class, I think, right? Did we talk about jellyfish? Did we talk about jellyfish? It was one of you guys, wasn't it? Talked about jellyfish? Yeah, you and I talked about jellyfish. I thought so. So jellyfish are kind of slightly immortal, which is kind of cool. So, remember our sponges, all just cells, they can break off and make more copies of themselves? That's an immortal organism. If you could chop off your arm and grow another you might die, but if your DNA continues and it's essentially just a clone of you, you're not really dead. Makes sense? You've continued on. You're still alive. You might be, the original you might be dead, but your DNA is still going on in full strength. Make sense? Kind of understand what immortal means in the biological concept on that one. Unchanged DNA, not necessarily the same organism. Jellyfish can do the same thing. Cool. Now you see our little upside down jellyfish right there? Jellyfish come in two forms. I bet you guys didn't know this. You've got something called the polyp and the medusa. Now you guys, when you think of a jellyfish, you guys think of the medusa stage. That's the floaty around one that looks like this. That's the stereotypical jellyfish. That's the polyp. That's the other form of a jellyfish. Makes sense? That's the asexual reproducing form of a jellyfish. Cool? Ready? I want you guys to imagine a stack of solo cups, red solo cups. Make sense? You know, you put one at the bottom and the stack gets taller. Make sense? This is exactly how these things work. You have the little jellyfish right down here at the bottom, the jellyfish organism, the ground, and it's attached to the ground. Cool? Right here you have something called a polyp bud. Or a medusa bud, excuse me. And it's essentially a little tiny baby jellyfish production facility. Makes sense? It's going to make a little tiny baby jellyfish. Cool. And right underneath it, it's going to produce another little tiny baby jellyfish. And then another one. And then another one. And then another. And just adds to it. Make sense? Cool. As it adds to it, the stack gets taller and taller as the little jellyfish get pushed up to the top and mature. Make sense? Eventually what's going to happen is the top tall jellyfish is going to break away and form our stereotypical free-floating Medusa jellyfish. That's what you guys think of as a jellyfish, right? Let's say he gets damaged and broken. Make sense? Or he just wants to sexually reproduce and he lets go of some sperm and eggs. Make sense? Both of these will work. He can revert back to a polyp form if he wants to. Or he releases some sperm, finds another female jellyfish, the eggs fertilize, and they form a little tiny modal jellyfish baby that looks nothing like that, that's going to make a polyp tree that makes more baby jellyfish. Weird, right? Jellyfish are super strange. Bet you guys had no earthly idea that nature was quite as weird as it is. So, they don't die. Makes sense? They die if you squish them with a tray or you cut them in half, but their DNA doesn't die. The same jellyfish DNA, essentially the exact same organism, can live forever. Kind of weird, right? So that's how they make more baby jellyfish. They can either sexually reproduce to make this thing, and that's going to make asexual baby jellyfish, and that's where your baby jellyfish come from. Little polyp tree. So you got jellyfish that look like this that you guys would never think of as a jellyfish, and then you got the regular jellyfish. Same species, weird things. Cool though, huh? So that's the upside down version, and then you got the free floating one. Strange, right? I like jellyfish. I think they're cool. So, huzzah! Do you guys remember we talked about coral last week? The little coral organism that sits inside? It's basically an upside down jellyfish. You guys get the idea? That's all it is. Imagine a jellyfish stuck upside down and stuck on his head. That's all it is. Makes sense, guys? That's what a coral is. It's a jellyfish. And a sea anemone, it's an upside down jellyfish. Pretty cool? Pretty neat how these things work. Sea anemones, I bet you guys have all seen Finding Nemo, right? Okay. Sea anemones sting their clownfish. Did you guys know that? They do sting their clownfish for about 2 weeks. And the clownfish have to evolve a natural immunity to their own specific sea anemone. And if the clownfish leaves that specific sea anemone and goes to another sea anemone, it has to do it all over again. Make sense? So they do sting them. The clownfish just have to become used to it. Makes sense? So, and then once they become used to it, I assume the sea anemone still stings them, just naturally speaking, just because the sea anemone doesn't know what it's doing. But the clownfish just doesn't care. They do get stung. Kind of weird, right? Did you guys also know the other one that Nemo would have mated with his dad, and Marlin would have become a female? That's what those things do. They change their gender quite regularly. Lots of fish species can do it. Clownfish do it quite regularly. So when the dominant female is gone, the dominant male now becomes the dominant female, and then the marlin would have become Marlena, and then she would have gone from there. So that's how that would have really worked in actuality. It's also that movies caused a drastic decline of clownfish in the wild. So huzzah! People go out and catch them for home aquariums. Yeah. So cool so far on this, guys. Makes sense? Lots of billions of different cool jellyfish. They all come in different shapes, sizes, textures, but they're basically just the exact same thing. One big hole, stuff comes in, stuff goes right back out. That's called a non-complex, an open-ended, one-way gastrointestinal system. There's lots of different names for this. It's an incomplete, that's the word I was looking for, incomplete gastrointestinal tract. One hole, ours is complete. 2 holes. Make sense? Cool so far? Awesome, awesome. Huzzah! I just showed you guys how that works. Okay. One little step up from our jellyfish to our mollusk. Since guys, now mollusk, you guys think of mollusk when you think of snails and slugs and oysters and things, right? Cool? That's what you guys think of when you think of a mollusk. Now, I bet you really don't think of mollusk when you think of things like octopuses and squids, right? Those are mollusks too. Now, the technical definition of a mollusk is a soft-bodied animal. They're very squishy. They don't have bones. It's a big deal, right? Bones are a big deal. Soft and squishy. They're very, very, very simple mollusks. Makes sense, guys, in the fossil record. I'll talk about that in a second. But they have an external shell. That's a big deal. Make sense? You guys are, sorry, a hard shell, not necessarily external. A hard shell that protects their bodies. Cool? Think of an oyster, think of a clam, think of a snail, right? Cool. And they have a weird eating organism, a system called Arachnids. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's go back to the beginning. Soft-bodied critters. Critters that are soft and squishy. Being soft and squishy is a big deal. If you get squished on, you're going to flap, but you're also more than likely going to survive falling off something. Makes sense? You're not going to break. Cool, so there are benefits and stuff to that. But being soft-bodied means you're stuck around water. Mollusks these guys are stuck in water. Makes sense? Most mollusks are aquatic. There's quite a billion of them. But snails and slugs and things that come out on the land, they're still stuck around water. Makes sense, guys? They have to be moist. Remember we talked about water being a big deal? The farther you can get away from reproduction in water and life in general with the water, the more evolutionarily you are complex. Still stuck around water. Cool. So, they have to be moist. They're soft-bodied. Moisture is required for soft-bodied organisms. Makes sense? You gotta be, if you're a squishy critter, you gotta have water to be able to function, because that's what keeps your body open, inflated basically with the water. Cool. These guys, for the most part, have shells. You guys think of mollusk as an oyster. One shell on the top, one shell on the bottom, right? Something called a bivalve. One on top, one on bottom. Make sense? Two bivalves. You also have monovalves that have one shell, and they basically just stick to the bottom of the ocean floor. Make sense? Those are called chitons, or you guys may have seen these before if you ever go to the I can't think of the word now. It'll come to me a little later. But chitin is the one I can think of off the top of my head. There's another one, another little species that people eat pretty regularly. It's just one little shell. Makes sense, guys? It looks like half of a clam shell. And the little organism sits underneath the clam shell and just suction cups itself to the rocks. Make sense? So monovalves, bivalves, those are what you typically think of. And then you think of things like a slug or a snail. Those are other mollusks, right? Snails have shells. You guys know that, right? Slugs don't. But do they? That's the interesting part. So there are quite a few mollusks that have shells that you can't see. Anybody here ever eaten calamari or made their own calamari at home? You guys know what calamari is? It's chopped up squid, chopped up octopus. Okay, so it's actually pretty good. Supposedly I've never eaten it. It's quite chewy, but I've never had it. But anyway, if you clean a squid or if you clean an octopus, they have a shell on the inside of it. Okay, if you've ever cleaned a squid, you have to pull it out of them. A little tiny clear thing. You can see it on the inside. Octopuses have a very small one. Anybody here have a pet bird? If you've ever had a pet bird, you give them things called cuttle bones. That's what I'm talking about. They chew on that, keep their beaks worn down, get the little minerals in their diet, calcium and stuff. That's actually a bone from a cuttlefish, which is essentially an octopus cousin. Make sense? They have shells on the inside of them. So, you can see them on the outside on most of them, but the ones that you can't, they have internal shells. Makes sense? Their shells are just greatly reduced from evolution. Makes sense? Things like octopuses are so slim and squishy that they can get inside of bottles. Anywhere that their little beak can go, I'll talk about that in a second, they can get inside of. Exceptionally intelligent. Cool. Talk about that in a second. So anyway, cool so far on the hard shell concept. Most of them have external shells that are nice and hard. Not all of them though. Cool. Snails, when they first evolved, came in every single concept you could possibly imagine for a snail. There are thousands of different types of fossil skeletons of snails, fossil shells, that are all nice and compact like modern day snails. And then you have ones that are nice and, imagine somebody taking a pipe cleaner, twisting it up like that and then stretching it out. That's what they look like. Makes sense, guys? Unicorn horns that are twisty and things like that. Real long, straight snails. All different variations of snails until we got to the functional, rounded up and squished together snail body that you can think of all. Makes sense, guys? They're all out there. Those ones just didn't work well, and they didn't continue on. Weird, right? I didn't really know that existed until recently, but that's kind of cool. Snails also exist in right-handed or left-handed, which way their shells switch, clockwise or counterclockwise. Counterclockwise snails can't mate with clockwise snails, even if it's the same species. That's how their genomes line up. And that has a lot to do with the pollution concept in the water. Kind of strange, right? So environmental factors can influence how snails' bodies are formed. Very strange. Most mollusks, if you think of an octopus, they don't have these, but if you think of things like a snail and a slug and things, the way that they eat is pretty cool. It's kind of stereotypical for this file. You guys ever used a belt sander? You guys know what a belt sander is? Hold it this way, got a little round belt that sits this way about that wide and it just scrapes off the surface. You guys know what I'm talking about? Imagine one of those strapped to your face. And that's how they eat. Make sense? So they have a belt sander strapped to their face and they go, and at the bottom of the belt sander, instead of having a little bag that collects the sawdust, that's where their stomach sits. So they just scrape off algae and scrape off nutrients and goodies off the surface of the rock as they move along, and they scrape it off into their stomach. Pretty cool, right? It's actually a little series of teeth that work kind of like this. As it goes around, it'll open, then it opens up again at the back, comes around, and then closes again to scrape stuff off the rock. Opens up, lets stuff out, comes around, and then closes again. Makes sense as it goes around the circle. Very strange little feeding apparatus called a radula. Cool. Most of these guys have this. Things that have shells, they filter feed. Things like octopus or clams and oysters and stuff, they filter feed. But very simple. You guys get the filter feeding concept. Very simple. Not very very fancy for that one. They spur out sperm and eggs randomly into the environment again. So very random reproduction. Nothing fancy there. Slugs, on the other hand, these and snails and stuff, they have really weird reproduction. I can go on all about this. Reproduction in animals is exceptionally strange. Snails and slugs, snails in particular, have things called love darts. And this is super weird. It's a totally non-functional thing. You're a female slug, I'm a male slug. We're gonna mate. We get right next to each other, and I, as the male sponge, it literally looks like a harpoon. He gets right next to me and he shoves this thing through her skin and literally just fires this dart, puncturing her skin. Make sense? It doesn't do anything. It literally has no evolutionary function whatsoever. It probably did at some point in time, but not anymore. We think it might make them slightly more reproductively accessible to taking in sperm, but that's basically it. And then they mate. And they mate upside down, hanging from the air on a giant long thing of snot. And they intertwine their bodies together. And the males and females, since they're hermaphrodites, the penises intertwine, and the penises swap sperm, and then they bring the sperm back in, and then they fertilize their own eggs. Yeah, it's awesome, isn't it? Aren't you guys glad we don't do that? So, very strange how they reproduce. Nature is freaking weird. Make sense? So, that's kind of why I like evolution so much. It's all just stupid. It's all just dumb. It's all just goofy. Make sense? I don't think anybody with some type of thought or brain behind that would ever come up with something that dumb. Makes sense? That's just stupid. That's way more complex than it needs to be. Cool on that? You guys get that? Really simple. Make sense so far? Little step up. Getting some organs here, getting some tissues, made a little step up the evolutionary ladder. Still soft and squishy, still stuck in the water. Or very close to it. Makes sense? Alright. Cool so far? Down here we have our gastropods. These guys are essentially a foot with a mouth. Gastro meaning stomach, pod meaning foot. Makes sense? It's a mouth foot. That's essentially all it is. It's a moving little body with a mouth stuck to it. Really all they are. Makes sense? Up inside of their their shell, they can suck their whole body up in there, but all that sits up inside of there is their digestive and reproductive tracts. Makes sense? So nothing fancy up inside of it. Down here, sea slug has no visible shell, but on the inside, sits right about there. It's going to have a very reduced, tiny shell that sits underneath it. Cool. You guys, have you ever seen a slug before and you get that little, looks like a saddle on their back? The shell sits right underneath it. Cool. You have your scallop, bivalve, hinged shells, things like clams and stuff. They filter feed. They have a really strong muscle that sits on the inside that they can pull their shells shut with. You guys have ever tried to open one? You can't open it. Make sense? Cool. That's what they do. They clamp themselves shut really tightly. They filter feed from the environment. They concentrate stuff inside of them from the environment. If it's toxins or something from the water, they filter feed it out. We talked about that with paralytic shellfish poisoning. Remember algae and stuff? These guys will filter algae from the environment. If the algae makes toxins, the toxins get concentrated up inside of those. Make sense? Then you eat a nice big old pot of scallops, big old pot of oysters that's full of toxins, and then you die. Make sense? And that happens fairly often to people. Make sense? So it's called paralytic shellfish poisoning. If you get too much of that toxins, it'll kill you pretty quick. Make sense, guys? Produced by algae and stuff. Red tides, you guys ever heard of that? That's what that is. Cool. You're not supposed to eat filtering organisms for about 2 to 3 months after a red tide, so it gives them time to filter out all those toxins and get rid of them. Make sense? So they filter stuff out in the environment, reproduction just by putting out sperm and eggs in the environment. There's a species of these called mussels. You guys have heard of those, right? Freshwater mussels. You guys have ever been to a pond around here, lake around here? You've probably seen their shells. The way they reproduce is super cool. They have little teeny tiny parasitic baby larvae. I'm just talking here because I hope this is interesting to you. They have tiny little baby parasitic larvae called Phylogeny. And what they do is the mama mussel, when she's ready to get rid of her babies, when her babies are ready to leave, they're tiny little parasitic, they look like mussels with like little vampire fangs on them. Makes sense? And they're microscopic. What she does is she has this little tiny extension of her muscle that pokes out that looks like a worm or a fish, something, and she wiggles it around in the environment. Makes sense? And then you, as the dummy fish you are going to come up and try to eat this. Make sense? And then when you get too close, the mollusk will grab a hold of that fish in her mouth. Makes sense? In her shell. And then she'll go and blow all of her little baby glochidia into the mouth of that fish. Make sense? And then all those little parasitic vampire babies will grab a hold of the inside of that fish's body on the gills. And they latch a hold and start sucking out blood from the fish gills. And then eventually they'll grow to the point where they're big enough where they'll drop off of the fish and go land in the water, and then they start to filter feed like they're supposed to. That's pretty neat, right? So freshwater mollusks are really dependent on the fish in their environment around them because they usually only do that with 1 or 2 species of fish. Makes sense? So if their species of fish goes away, the mollusk goes away as well. Cool? So very, very, very dependent. Make sense? And then we have our mollusk over here that you guys are pretty familiar with, at least I hope so. One of my favorite critters on the planet is Nautilus. We have fossils of these things that date back forever. This is basically an octopus inside of a snail shell. Make sense, guys? Cool? Basically all that is. His little body is curled up inside of the shell instead of being poked out. Makes sense? Now, he can poke his little tentacles and stuff out, but his head is curled up in there. Make sense? That thing has the intelligence of an average 4-year-old, which is pretty nuts. These are one of the 2 critters, other than the hinged guys, that don't have radulas. They have beaks. If you've ever seen an octopus, right in the middle of his little tentacles sits a beak. And it looks just like a parrot beak. It's exceptionally sharp and exceptionally dangerous. Squids have them too. Make sense? So squids and things like that. Octopuses have those beaks. They bite, that's how they hunt, that's how they kill things. And they'll take your leg off or your hand off or your arm off if you get close to one of them and it's big enough to do it. Those giant squids can do that. They bite really hard too, by the way. Cool. What's the difference between tentacles and arms? Do you guys know? Octopuses have arms. Squids have tentacles. Okay? Arms have suckers all the way up them. Tentacles have halfway. That's the difference. He has arms. His suckers go all the way up. Make sense? They don't. Cool so far? Squids don't. They have tentacles that go halfway up. Cool. Now, when octopuses reproduce, it's exceptionally strange. The male octopus will grow another set of legs. They have 10 legs. Kind of weird, right? Instead of 8. And those 2 extra set of legs are called heterococcyli. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the term of it. And those 2 legs are meant for reproduction. Cool. Now inside of that little bell, the mantle of the octopus, is essentially just an inflated balloon that's full of water. Make sense? And inside of there, there's 2 little, you can see this little thing right here in the back. That's a hole. And he's going to suck up water and push it out like a jet engine. That's how they move around. Make sense? He sucks up water in the bell, squeezes it, pushes it out, sucks it up, squeezes it, pushes it out. Make sense? You guys get the idea? Well, all around the inside of that bell is his brain and all the other goodies that are important for them to function. Make sense? Cool? So, the male octopus will form his little heterococcyli, and he'll reach up inside of his own little bell through those little holes and grab a pocket of sperm. Make sense? And then when they're ready to reproduce, he goes like this. And he fits his little heterococcyli, the sperm in it, up inside of the female's bell, and sticks them up inside of her reproductive organs and deposits his sperm inside of her little body. And then pulls his little arms out, and then the arms will fall off and go away. Super creepy. Kind of weird, right? I think it's fascinating. I think it's just super weird. They're just strange the way they work. So each one of those little arms has independent control over itself. If it's cut off, it can go do whatever it wants to. Make sense? So, if you've ever talked to people that keep octopuses as pets, they will routinely break out of their cages and come hang out with you. So they'll come chill and hang out, and they'll try to like get you to feed them and stuff like that. They can spend a couple of hours out of the water, so they'll break out of their cages and stuff. They don't live very long, which is kind of sad. The average lifespan is about 4 to 5 years for an octopus. That's kind of sad. Something that smart, something that cute, they die really quickly. Cool. Cool far on these guys. I like octopus. I think you're neat. Mollusk. So cool so far on this. I'm not going to really worry about this. We've got the foot used for movement. Now in the case of our octopus, you guys get the idea. They have 8 of them. If you're a clam or something like that, if you've ever seen a clam, you guys may have ever seen the little thing called a gooey duck. It's really, really disgusting looking clam. If you've ever seen another clam picture, you may have seen them poke their tongue out. You know what I'm talking about? That little tongue is called a foot. That's how they move around. They stick that on the ground and then they pull themselves to it. Make sense? That's basically what it is. And on the inside, you got all the stuff that makes their shells, the mantle. Makes sense? And that's all it is. You guys know about pearls, right? Pearls are produced by pretty much every single species of mollusk. Kind of weird, right? There are different types of pearls. Pearls are usually, what you guys think of as pearls, are produced by something called nacre. That's what makes up a pearl. If you've ever looked at the inside of an oyster, you see that mother of pearl layer, right? That's made up of nacre. You guys have probably heard that pearls are produced when you get a piece of sand up inside of a mollusk and it irritates it, right? And it starts to put the nacre around it. That's totally false. That's a bunch of crap. How they get their, that's how they make farmed pearls, by the way. How a natural pearl is formed is when the outside of a mollusk shell is broken or damaged. Make sense? Something hits them on the outside, it breaks the shell on the inside. Make sense? They have a little tiny sharp piece of shell poking around, floating on the inside of their shell. That's irritating. Make sense? They don't get sand in the inside of their shell. There's no way for it to get there. It'd be like you getting sand on the inside of your skin. It's not gonna happen. So they start coating that little piece of broken shell with nacre, and that's what a real pearl is. Make sense? There are quite a few other types of pearls that are formed not nacre. They're called non-nacreous pearls, and those things are super valuable, by the way, because they're very rare the way they form. Cool. So pearls are neat, formed by lots of different species. Cool so far? Okay. This is our little ratula. Get the idea? Basically just a belt sander. Scrapes things off. Cool. This is scrapes things off, it brings it up into the mouth, and then it's eaten. Cool. That's a slug and a sponge in a nutshell. Cool. Or slug and a snail. Alright. On to worms. Yay, worms. Okay. They're a step up our evolutionary ladder because they're bilaterally symmetrical. Most of our, these guys are also going to be bilaterally symmetrical. I forgot to mention that. But not all of them. Clams are not. So some, not all species are. Most of them are. Alright. These guys are also fancy because they get up to not always being hermaphrodites. And that's kind of a big deal. When you make that jump from everybody's male and female to defined genders or defined sexes, if you like, things get a step up the evolutionary ladder. Make sense? It makes things more difficult but less difficult at the same time. Make sense? You can reproduce with anybody you come in contact to, but your genetic gene pool is going to be very limited. When you're different genders, your genetic gene pool is going to be harder to, going to be hard to reproduce if you don't run into somebody, but makes your genetics become more varied. Makes sense? So drawbacks and pluses for that. Anyway, these are the most simple bilateral animals that you can find. Very simple. They don't have complete digestive tracts. Most of these guys eat and poop out the same hole, same way as a jellyfish. Makes sense? Very, very, very simple. Lots of these guys are parasites. If you've ever been to a vet clinic, there's lots of these that are parasites for animals, lots of these parasites for humans as well. But quite a few of these you can find just swimming around in your front yard in the dirt. Makes sense, guys? Anybody in here heard of the, I think they call it the hammerhead worm, the invasive hammerhead worm this year? So hammerhead worms are a version of these guys called a Planarian. I'll show you guys what these look like. They're super creepy, but they're super cool. They're starting to make their way into Tennessee now. They're an invasive species, but they look like this. You guys can kind of get the idea? They eat earthworms. They're predators of earthworms. Makes sense? And they actively hunt earthworms, and they can grow about that long. Makes sense? So if you see one of these in your front yard, call the TWRA. Don't touch it. They're they'll bite you. Makes sense? Don't touch them. Scoop it up in like a jar or something like that, just or with a stick. Don't touch them. Makes sense? They're super, super dangerous. They'll bite, they'll live and hang out of you. But call the TWRA if you find them. They want to know that if you find them. This is one of those little free-living flatworms. Makes sense? That lives in the water. So a lot of these are microscopic, and then some of them you can see they get up really large. Makes sense? But they're basically all just the same thing. Very simple little critters. On the inside of these things, not a whole lot going on. Basically this. They've got tiny little primitive eyes that just detect light. Makes sense? They don't detect vision. They are pictures. They don't detect color. It's just presence or absence of light. Makes sense? This guy right here is a Planarian. The other one, the hammerhead one I showed you, is a different type of Planarian. This is the stereotypical one that we use in labs. We can order these live. They're really cute. They're cross-eyed. They're super derpy looking. If you cut them in half, they grow another head. Makes sense? So you can actually take them, and people do this in a lab fairly regularly. They'll cut them, and they'll make little heads of them grow around in big circles. You've got 15 or 20 little heads poking out of one body. Makes sense? So that, once again, that evolutionary simple ability to regenerate body parts. Makes sense? So I wish we had that. Well, anyway, eye spot. They have nerve tissues, which is cool. They have slight reproductive tissues, which is cool, but they're really not that fancy. Makes sense? Nothing going on really much inside of them. They eat and poop out of the same hole. You guys can see their mouth there. It's called a pharynx. And these guys, what they do is essentially when they want to eat something, they eat out of their belly button. They do this. They just wrap around it. Makes sense? So whatever they want to eat, they just wrap their little bodies around, and that's how they eat. Super weird. They also poop uric acid so they kill themselves, which is really dumb. So if you have them in a lab, in a culture, you have to grow them in one top spot, feed them in a different one, and then move them back. So they're such a pain. So I hate these things. Cool so far? This is a tapeworm. You guys have ever seen a tapeworm before? Tapeworms are horrifying. Tapeworms are also flatworms. This is how tapeworm works. This right here is the tapeworm. Down below that line is not. From here up is the tapeworm. Make sense? Now that's the tapeworm's body, but that's not the tapeworm. Cool? Now here up sits the tapeworm. This is what it looks like from there up. These are hooks. This is called the scolex, this little horrifying part, right? So you get a tapeworm inside of you, and it's going to go down to your intestines. Make sense? You can see it's flatworm. That's the name. What it's going to do is it's going to stick these little hooks on the inside of your intestinal wall. Make sense? It doesn't eat. It doesn't have a digestive system. It doesn't have a mouth. Because you have all that stuff for it. You have a mouth, you have teeth, and you have a digestive tract. Make sense? So what it's going to do is it's going to make its little body all the way down through you, through your intestines, and it's going to suck up nutrients from whatever you eat. Suck up from your poop. Make sense? Stuff that's going through your intestines, it's just going to absorb it through its body wall as it goes by. Make sense? You get a big enough one or enough of these in your body, they'll kill you. They can suck so much of your nutrients out that you don't get enough nutrients in your actual body to survive, and you have severe malnutrition issues because of it.
How do you get that inside of you?
Well, people used to buy them, and you can order them. People used to have a magazine it's called Woman's World. If you guys have ever seen those old magazines from like 1880, my mom has it framed at home. And on the inside of it, there's a literal article that says, order so-and-so's miracle weight loss cure, sends 5 cents for tapeworm egg. And you would order them in the newspaper and take the little egg, and then whenever you lost enough weight, it'll hatch inside of you and grow. Whenever you lost enough weight, on the back of the article it says send 5 cents for so-and-so's miracle weight loss tapeworm cure. And then it's a little bottle of arsenic, and you drink a little bottle of arsenic and hope it doesn't kill you, but it'll kill the tapeworm. And there you go. Well, how do you regularly get these? Yeah. You guys have all seen the little Bible verse that says don't eat pork. You guys know why? Cows. Makes sense, guys. We'll talk about how this works in a second. Cool. Alright, awesome. Really, you get these things through through feces, contamination like that. Makes sense. Now we'll talk about how this works in a second. So, cool so far. Anyway, so it sucks into your intestines. Makes sense. This is where it's going to suction all the goodies out, suction all the food by. And right here, you see all these little segments. Those are called proglottids. Works just like our jellyfish. You guys remember the little suction? You have the little red solo cup at the bottom. It gets bigger. These are egg sacs. See down here, they're quite small. And at the bottom down here, they're really big. Makes sense? Inside are billions of eggs. Makes sense? Down here, this thing can fertilize itself, or it gets sperm one time, and it's good for the rest of its life. Makes sense? One tiny little non-mature proglottid, baby eggs. Down here, very, very, very mature, very fully ready to go eggs. Makes sense? This thing breaks off in your intestines. Makes sense? It's about this big. Cool? You pass it through your feces. Makes sense? And this is how regularly we get them. Makes sense? They mostly exist in animals. Cool? And this makes sense if you think about it. Because you're not going to be going around eating poop off the ground. But cows do. Makes sense? They eat grass. And then the grass is poop. And they get a hold of some of these eggs. The eggs hatch inside of their system. And it starts over again. Makes sense? But occasionally, somebody doesn't cook their food well enough. You get enough of these things in your system, they can't all live in your intestines. They'll move out into the muscle tissue. Makes sense? And when they move out into the muscle tissue, they can't do anything. Makes sense? They can't function. They can't reproduce. They basically just go to sleep. And they go to sleep in things called cysts. And they wait there until the ones in your intestines die, and then they can move back in. Make sense? Now, who knows how long that's going to be. And sometimes you can end up with billions of cysts all over your entire body. Make sense? Just how it is. Doesn't really harm you unless they get into your brain in important places. But somebody doesn't cook their meat well enough, and those little cysts aren't killed, undercooked meats. You eat a cyst, and a cyst is basically a little tiny baby tapeworm, and then all of a sudden it wakes up inside of you. And there you go. Make sense? That's how we regulate, or you eat some feces off the ground. So that's how they go usually transmit around. And the Bible tells you not to eat pork because where do pigs usually live? In the garbage pits. Makes sense? It's not necessarily because pigs are dirty from a spiritual or religious standpoint. It's because they eat filth, which is where people threw their garbage and their feces and their nastiness at. So pigs had parasites inside of them. So they told you not to eat pigs because you were likely to get sick from the stuff inside of a pig and not some not supernatural curse. It makes sense if you think about it. Cool. Very interesting on these, right? So, cool how tapeworms work. Pretty neat. A little piece breaks off, and then these things can get up to about 10, 15 feet long inside of your intestines. Just super, super cool. Huzzah. Cool so far? Okay. Annelids. You guys have heard of annelids before if you've ever seen an earthworm. Makes sense? An earthworm is not a flatworm. An earthworm is a roundworm. Makes sense? And that's a big deal because this guy is our very first critter with a complete digestive system. So far we've been talking about critters that poop and eat out of the same hole. That sounds not so much fun, right? That sounds sort of fun. But these guys don't have to deal with that. We're finally getting into things that have different holes for different things. So earthworms. Earthworms are fancy because they have our pseudocoelom, tube within a tube. Oh, no, sorry, these are coelamates. Sorry, I was wrong on that. So they have our true body plan. Things are separated off. Cool. So fancy on that. They have a mouth and they have an anus. If you've ever seen a worm eat or been pooped on by a worm, you know what I'm talking about. Because if you pick up worms and go fishing with them, they poop on you quite regularly. So that's always fun. So they have a complete digestive tract, mouth on one end, anus on the end, and all the way through the middle. Food goes from one end to the other, it does not come back up. And that's a big key characteristic. We don't want stuff that's been digested to come back out. Make sense? So we don't want that. Big thing there. Their bodies are also segmented. You guys have seen that in a second. I'll show you in a second. The little segments on a worm. If you ever look at a worm, they got little lines on the inside of them. Make sense? I'll show you in a second what that looks like. Okay. There's lots of different types of worms. There's earthworms. There's polychaetes. And then there's leeches. And those are our big types of worms here. Yeah, leeches are horrifying. I also learned that there are non-aquatic leeches. Leeches that live in the rainforest. That's fun, right? They don't have to worry about the water. That sounds horrifying. So you can walk along in the rainforest and then they just live on the ground and on the trees and stuff and they get you that way. But if you think about it, they're still stuck to the water because they live in the rainforest. Makes sense? It rains all the time there, hence the name. Stuck in the ground, it's wet there. These guys live in the water, and these guys are basically either going to be stuck to the water or stuck in a really, really, really wet environment. So we really haven't gone anywhere yet. Makes sense? We're still stuck in the water. Still stuck at the very beginning. So our earthworms are really cool. You guys are familiar with earthworms. Do I need to go over earthworms? Earthworms are very, very important. They lubricate the soil. They irrigate the soil just by moving it around and breaking it up, making it easier for plants to move around and their roots and stuff in. They add nutrients back to the soil. Most of the species of earthworms you have in the United States are invasive, but you guys didn't know that either. They've been introduced from Europe and or Asia through people bringing in plants. People bring in plants, they bring the soil that the plant's in, and then the worms that are in the soil come in with them. Make sense? So we have quite a few invasive species of earthworms here. It's weird to think about an earthworm as an invasive species, but they are. Christmas tree worms, these guys are super cool. Have you ever seen a fan worm? You guys have all seen Indian money before? Little fossil outside with a little hole in the middle. The hole in the middle, this thing sits in the middle of it. And he sticks out the top of the little hole. Make sense? Cool. That's basically what Indian money is. Little worm lives in the middle of the hole. Cool. And then our leeches. Freshwater living critter. They bite you, they suck the blood out of you, and then they poop it out the other end. Big deal, right? These guys produce anticoagulants in their saliva, so when they bite you, they also produce painkillers, so you don't feel when they bite you, and it also keeps your blood from clotting, so they can just sit there and drink all day long. Fun, right? Yay! Go so far on that? So these guys are segmented. This is our big deal here. Once you hit this little center middle here, you guys know what I'm talking about? Everything's just a repeating unit of itself. All those little segments are just carbon copies of one another. Cool. Up at the front, however, we have our mouth. We have our brain, very simplistic little blob of neurons. Makes sense, guys? Not a brain in the sense of what we have, it's just a blob of nerve cells. Makes sense, nothing fancy. They have 8 or 9 hearts, which is super cool. They have lots of, so they have a main heart here, and then they have all these little accessory hearts that are on the side of it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they have 10 of them actually, sorry. 10 accessory hearts and 1 big heart. And they all pump together to make their blood move around. Down the middle of it, you have its digestive tract. And that's the part that goes all the way down to the end. You can see our segmental wall here, the little tube within a tube thing. Because remember that, where its digestive tract goes, all the little important stuff on the outside with its internal organs and stuff. separated out from everybody else. Cool. Once you get to the middle here, after you get past the little, I think this is called like a ciliate or something, the little thing in the middle. I can't remember the actual name of it. All the little rest of the segments are going to be nerve cell with 2 little nerves coming off the side. Basically, in each little segment. Makes sense? Nerve cell coming through with 2 little offshoots, 2 little cells. And that little nerve cell runs all the way through. All the way through. Makes sense? And then from there all the way back, nothing going on. Just one big giant long nerve cell. Cool. Another digestive tract. Pretty fancy. Pretty simple. True digestive tract, big deal. True coelom, big deal. Most of these are non-hermaphroditic, also kind of a big deal. Make sense? Cool. Awesome. So, roundworms, not going to talk about these too much. You guys get the idea. They're tapered at both ends and they're round. Do I really need to worry about that? This is what you think of when you think of an earthworm. Cool. Quite a lot of these parasitize humans. Quite a lot of these parasitize animals. Okay. If you guys ever heard of hookworms and stuff like that, that's what these guys are. So quite a few of these will parasitize people. Cool. This is another one. You've heard of trichognosis. Trichognosis in pork. This is another one that's transmitted that same concept of cysting up in the body. And this is what mostly you're worried about in pork. The other one comes from beef. So
My dog threw up one of them one time.
a worm? Yeah, the dogs get them all the time.
I thought it was a string, I picked it up and it swelled up, and I had to take him to the vet and he got,
Yeah, get
but he got it
worms.
in the yard.
Yeah, dogs get them all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're supposed to regularly worm your dogs and cats and stuff as they go outside. So I used to have a pet raccoon when I was a kid, and we got her from the wild. Her mom got hit by a car, and we had her for about 2.5 years, and we rehabilitated her and let her go. So she came back about 6 months later. That was super cool. I grew up on a big farm. We were sitting on the front porch, and my dad was reading a newspaper, and it'd been like 6 months since we let her go. She just walks around outside the house and crawls up and sits in his lap. She hung out for about 30 minutes, and she left. That was pretty cool. But when we wormed her, ooh man, that was like spaghetti city, dude. That was gross. But when you kill these things, your eukaryotic cells, their eukaryotic cells, it's very difficult to kill a eukaryotic organism inside of you. Prokaryotic cells, they're drastically different. So I can give you a medication that kills them that won't kill you. Make sense? But when I kill a eukaryotic pathogen, these guys, there's nothing different. You're basically the same. So you're going to have some severe side effects for it. That's why you get so sick. That's why your animals get so sick when you worm them. Makes sense? But if you take antibiotics, you don't, because it doesn't kill you. The drugs that kill these are also killing you, because you're eukaryote. Make sense? So worms, so far so good. Awesome. So arthropods. Arthropods get their name from the fact that they have pods, arms and legs and stuff, that are jointed. Arthro means moving. Make sense, guys? So articulated joints is what they are. You guys have all seen an arthropod before, right? What's an arthropod? Can you name me one? Lobster, right? You got another one? How about a bug? A beetle? Make sense, guys? Anything that's stereotypically that you would think of as a bug. Okay? Cool. Basically a bug. Earthworms are not bugs, as you guys just learned. You think of them as bugs, they're not bugs. They are annelids. Makes sense, guys? They are separate, they're clear. They're nice and wet and soft and squishy. These guys, on the other hand, what are we noticing with our arthropods that they are not, for the most part, going to be? They're nice and dry, right? Which means they're not so reliant on the water. This is the first phylum of critters that starts to conquer the land. Make sense? You really don't see lots of earthworms going on the land. They're in the soil, makes sense? They don't live on the land. There's not a lot of leeches that live on the land. But in our fossil record, we start to see tons of arthropods, little bug-looking critters, start to make the move. Sea scorpions and things like that start to make the move on the land. Make sense? They have hard exoskeletons on their bodies, which gives them protection from the environment. Make sense, guys? That's a big deal. And when you have a hard exoskeleton, it also keeps you from drying out. Make sense? That's another big deal. You're not going to just evaporate with the water loss when the sun hits you. So you can venture onto land and not worry about drying out in the sunshine. Make sense, guys? That's a big deal. So that's how arthropods are able to get away from the water. Make sense? They have a watery environment on the inside of them that they maintain with that hard body. Cool. Is this at least hopefully interesting? I know it's a longer lecture than usual, but I hope it's interesting. I love animals. So you guys are familiar with the way they move, right? They have a little segment here, and then where their joints at, they have a break in the set. It's like, just like a suit of armor. Make sense? So arthropods, first phylum to really move successfully out of the water evolutionary history onto the land. Make sense? And they did so because they have that hard exoskeleton that keeps them from drying out, and they can take their water with them. Cool. Awesome. So a lobster is an aquatic arthropod, but if you've ever seen an arthropod on the land, a lobster, they can do quite well on the ground, since they do fairly decently out of the water for quite a while. I bet you guys didn't know that these guys actually migrate for thousands of miles across the bottom of the ocean in a big, giant, long, straight, single file line, which is really funny. For hundreds of miles, they'll walk in a big old, giant, long, straight line from Florida all the way up to Maine. And that's just basically what they do. So, fun how they do that. So, hooray, lobsters. Lobsters are super cool. Bodies of arthropods, you guys have probably learned this since kindergarten. Head, thorax, abdomen, woo, right? You guys all know that stuff? Okay. They also have how many legs? You guys should know how many legs bugs have. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Those are, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4 walking legs, and then it's claws. They have 8 legs. Bugs have 8 legs. You guys knew that, right? Spiders and stuff, they have 8 legs, and they have their little claws. Okay. So, that's a big deal here. Bugs have 8 legs, okay? So if you don't have 8 legs, you're not a bug. Cool on that one? Okay. Or an arthropod, I should say. Arachnids are our stereotypical bugs that have 8 legs. And that's our stereotypical one you guys are going to think about with spiders and things like that. Cool? You've also got crustaceans, which are also going to have 8 legs. Those are going to be our things like crabs and lobsters and critters like that. Cool. I personally kind of find crabs creepy. I don't really know why. They just kind of weird me out a little bit. Millipedes and centipedes, which we'll talk about the difference between those in a second. Those are our few exceptions here that don't have 8 legs. Obviously, there's always going to be one exception that breaks the rule. And then our insects, which also have 8 legs. Cool. So there's our big deal here. I think insects may have 6, but I'm not going to swear to that. Go so far. So that's our different groups of arthropods. Our arachnids. There are a few species of arachnids that live in the water. And there were quite a few of them that lived in the water for billions of years that are extinct. Make sense? So we had giant skeletons of sea scorpions, giant sea spiders and things back in the ancient days. But those things are not extinct, thankfully. That sounds horrifying. About that long giant sea scorpion, that sounds horrifying. If you've ever seen them, they look like an aquatic scorpion, just exactly like you'd imagine, with kind of like a mermaid's tail. Don't want that coming after me. So most of them nowadays live on the land. They have a 4 pair of walking legs, that's our 8 legs, and then usually what they're going to have is some sort of pair of feeding apparatus. Makes sense, either a hunting, something that they're going to stab things with, catch things with, or eat with. Makes sense, an extra set of arms that they're going to do stuff with, a functional set of arms. And you guys are familiar with these if you think about spiders, scorpions, ticks, and things like that. And there you go. Cool. I love tarantulas. Anybody here ever had a pet tarantula? I love them. They're super cool. Would you agree?
Yep.
Once you get over the ugh factor of they're creepy, they're really cool pets. They're actually really cool creatures. So 8 legs, and up at the front you see those 2 little legs where they're pointed at. Those are called pedipalps, and that's how they're going to touch the world and feel around, and their fangs are going to be attached to those. Makes sense, guys? They're going to eat using those. Cool? They're really not creepy, I promise. If you ever get the opportunity to let one walk on you, just do it. They're really cool. I thought they were creepy too. I love them. Anyway, so these guys, spiders, tarantulas can live up to 20 some odd years, the females, which is really cool. The males on average live to be about 5. The males, once they reach sexual maturity, they don't molt anymore. And that's a big deal for bugs. If you can't molt, you can't grow, you can't fix damage, so they don't fix anything, they just die. Makes sense, their whole job is for reproduction. And usually what happens is when they mate, the spiders will rear up on their back legs, then they will do this, the male will come in, the female will come in, they'll overlock like this, their mouths will overlock, he'll put his pedipalps inside of hers, give her some sperm, and then she bites him on top of the head and kills him. That's usually how spiders mate. Makes sense? So males are kind of useless in this concept here. Our little silk weavers at the back here. Scorpion, we got our 4 walking legs and then our 2 accessory legs here. Things in the back, our little stinger. 4 accessory walking legs, and then our 2 little accessory moving legs at the top that does stuff. Cool. You guys probably don't think of ticks as these. 1, 2, 3, 4. And there are 2 little walking legs at the top. You guys can actually estimate your chances of having Lyme disease when you're bitten by a tick based on how many legs it has. Ticks molt their legs and grow more legs based on how many times they've fed. Ticks molt 3 times in their life. Once from the larval stage after their first feed, once again after their second one. Makes Makes sense? So they molt when they're babies and then 2 more times. Makes sense? So 3 molts in their entire life. The first molt they have 6 legs. Makes sense? As their little baby stage. Cool? If you find a stick that's on you with 6 legs, you're its first meal. Make sense? Your chances of having Lyme disease are basically 0. It's never bitten anything before. Make sense? Cool? Then it's going to molt after it's gotten blood and then it'll grow 8 legs. So if you find a tick with 8 legs on you, it's fed at least once. Make sense? And then it'll attack you, feed 1 more time, molt again, and then it's actually mature and able to go. Make sense? So 2 molts in their lifetime, 3 stages, and the number of legs increases as it molts. Cool. So that judges your chance of having Lyme disease. Cool. Pretty cool so far on these guys. Awesome, awesome. Crustaceans. There's also a difference between the types of feedy things that they have up there. If they have little round flat ones or munchy ones. Makes sense, guys? So different types of bugs get their names on what type of tab. So spiders have the nice little ones that do this with the things on the end, and then there's types of bugs that have munchy ones, and they get different classifications on it too. Anyway, so crustaceans, arthropods that live in the water. Makes sense? You guys are familiar with these? If you think about things like lobsters, crabs, shrimp, crayfish, crawdads, critters like that. Basically, they all kind of look like aquatic bugs. You know why they look like aquatic bugs? Because they're aquatic bugs. Makes sense? Basically all it is. Pretty easy on that one? Okay. So, there are quite a few of our arthropod crustaceans that don't live in the water, but they also live in very, very, very moist environments. Makes sense? They're stuck around the water too. So pill bugs, these guys have things called book lungs. They actually have to have moist lungs. Their lungs kind of sit on the bottom of their body, and they just kind of suck up oxygen from the water. Spiders have them too. So spiders had to have a moist environment as well. Even spiders that live in the desert, they go down in burrows at night and stuff that's cool, that's slightly damp, so they can breathe and stuff to keep their lungs moistureless. What's that? Makes sense? Our 6 little legs, and then we got 2 extra legs in the front that do something. Cool. Shrimping critters, all that good stuff. Awesome, awesome. Okay. And then we have our weird little guys, our 2 critters that don't necessarily fit in. Millipedes and centipedes. You guys have all heard millipedes have 1,000 legs, or million legs, centipedes have 100, right, or whatever it is. The real difference is centipedes have 1 set of legs per body segment, millipedes have 2. Make sense? So you guys have all seen a millipede before. You got leg, or little body segments. You guys know what I'm talking about? They look like trading cars. If you're a centipede, you got 1 set of legs. If you're a millipede, you got 2. That's how you tell them apart. Makes sense? The number of legs varies, obviously, depending on how big the critter is. Pretty easy on that. Centipedes are going to be terrestrial carnivores. They bite. Anybody ever been bitten by a centipede? I have not, but they sting really, really, really bad. You guys ever watch Coyote Peterson, the crazy guy on the internet that goes and gets stung by bugs? Alright, so if you haven't, you guys should watch that. He takes all the most top 10 painful bugs ever. I think one of them is a centipede, and he lets them bite him. It's just, so anyway, they are very voracious predators, centipedes are. Millipedes, for the other hand, are going to be pretty much the chillest little critters on the planet, and they eat dead stuff. Makes sense? They smell weird. They're all over the place. If you go look at them from outside, eating dirt and stuff, they're open a little ball, and then they'll poop on you too. So, hooray, right? Cool in that? Awesome. Cool. Come in all different shapes, sizes, colors. Some of them are really pretty, some of them are not. Both varieties come in different ones. Cool. You can find centipedes that people keep as pets that are huge. And then you can find millipedes that are the exact same thing that people keep as pets that are huge. And then they also come in little tiny versions. Cool. Yeah.
Centipedes are like lethal though, aren't they?
Not all of them, yeah, but some of them can be exceptionally, can kill you quite easily. Yeah, but not all of them. But this is their little things right here. They'll try to get you with their backs right here. I think they try to sting you with their back. I'm not real sure how those guys work, but I think they try to sting you with their back. I think their stingers are on the back, the same place like a scorpion. What's the front of these? Awesome, awesome. And then we got bugs. Do I need to talk about bugs? It's basically a bug. Head, thorax, abdomen, wings, 6 legs, or 8 legs, 4 on each side. You talk about bug? You guys got bugs? Bugs are everywhere. Bugs are the most successful phylum of creatures on the planet. There are millions of these for every one of us. There are more bugs on the planet of one single species of bugs than there are people on the planet. Makes sense, guys? There are literally billions of these creatures. Makes sense? They are the most successful, most diverse, most widespread creatures on the planet. Cool? Just insects. Everywhere on the planet. Basic, same body shape. Cool. Got our 8 legs, walking legs, head, thorax, abdomen, huzzah. Cool. Awesome, awesome. Another key characteristics of these guys is they shed and molt. Make sense? These guys have something called indirect development. Their babies look nothing like their adults. You guys have all seen a caterpillar before, right? Would you ever think that a caterpillar and a butterfly were even the same species if you didn't know anything about that? Okay. You ever seen a baby human? Would you think a baby human was the same species as an adult human? That's direct development. Our babies look identical to our adults, just small. Now, in indirect development, you got something that looks nothing like its adult. Makes sense? And that's a key characteristics in bugs and arthropods. They indirectly develop, metamorphosize. Make sense? How many of you guys think that the critters know what's going on inside of that cocoon when they do this? How many of you guys know what goes on in there? Oh, I do. They're fully conscious when they're metamorphosizing, and they can retain memories of what happened to them in their prior lives. So they know what's going on when they're turning into mush and their body's being rearranged inside of that cocoon. Sounds pleasant, right? They're fully conscious. They know this because they exposed caterpillars to painful shocks, and right before they gave them painful shocks, they sprayed a scent at them. And then afterwards, when the caterpillars metamorphosized into butterflies, all they had to do was spray the scent, and the butterflies would just hightail it out of there because they had associated it with pain. So they retain memories when they're being metamorphosized. That's creepy. Is that cool so far? Okay. Makes sense. So it's melting and turning into a butterfly, and it knows what's going on inside of there. That sounds horrifying. Cool? Awesome, awesome. Makes sense? Okay. Echinoderms. Derm means skin. Echino means armored. Makes sense? So things with armored skin. You guys have seen echinoderms before. This is our last little bit with things with backbones. What's an echinoderm? Anybody know one? Starfish. Got another one?
A sandal?
Yes, it is. Good job. Sea anemones, things like that. These guys are going to be our echinoderms. Makes sense? They're not segmented body critters. We don't have segmented body critters. We're one body. Makes sense? That's our big deal here. These guys are also going to be our first bilaterally symmetric critters that are going to be fully bilaterally symmetrical. They're just going on for the future. Radially as adult, but bilaterally as a larvae. That's weird. So these guys are going to be things like starfish and stuff, but their adults are radially symmetric, radiate out to the middle, circle, right? But the babies look like little teeny tiny footballs, fuzzy little jellyfish footballs. Makes sense, little baby jellyfish? They look like little footballs. So baby starfish don't look anything like adult starfish. They're bilaterally symmetric. They swim, they float around in the environment, then they start to grow their little arms, and then they become radially symmetric. Makes sense, guys? So they're higher up on the evolutionary scale because they are bilaterally symmetric animals. Make sense? They just grow arms as they mature. They also have true reproduction. They have true tissues, true body tissues, true body segments. They have a mouth. They have an anus. They're true body separation of reproductive systems and things like that. Cool? Very complex for what you'd think they are. Make sense? So they eat on one side and poop on the other of their body. Basically just goes through them. Make sense? So if you ever seen a starfish. Cool? Alright, anyway. The way these guys move around is super, super weird. They move by using water. Cool? So I'm going to try to do my best to explain this real simple, real easy. Here's our starfish. My wonderful drawing of a starfish. Make sense? And on the inside of our starfish, we have a little circle that does this on the outside of his body. Cool? And on the outside of a starfish, you guys see that little white spot? Cool? I can't remember what the name of that thing is called. If you hadn't asked me or hadn't actually needed to think about it, I don't know. But I can't remember what it's called. Well, anyway, that's where water is going to be brought in. Make sense? And basically what's going to exist on the inside of this, madreporite. That's the word, madreporite. That's what that's called. So, imagine a bunch of fin noodles. Make sense? You guys know the fin noodle got the little hollow tube in the middle? Full noodles? Imagine that in the shape of a circle with a little hose coming off of it. So, make sense? And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. One of them stuck to the middle going out in each leg. Make sense? Cool enough? So you got a little water hose system that runs all the way through the starfish. Make sense? So what's going to happen is the starfish is going to suck up water through that madreporite. Cool? It's going to come down in through the little thing around the little ring canal, is what that's called. The ring part. Make sense? Out through the radial canals into the arms. It's going to send the water out. Cool? And in each one of of its little arms, if you guys can see down here, on the bottom of it, are these little things called tube feet. And those little tube feet are essentially water balloons. And when there's no water in them, they're shriveled up. And when the critter wants to move, it's going to push water inside of them. Make sense? It'll push the water from the ring canal through the radial canal into the tube feet, and the tube feet goes. And then the critter will pull itself along, and then it'll suck the water out. Make sense? And then it'll spurt the water out of its leg, out of the tip of its leg. And then as it wants to move again, it'll move along. Make sense? So it's controlled by water. They move around by something called a water vascular system. Make sense, guys? Very strange. No bones, but they move around by water. Pretty cool, right? So these guys are actually really endangered, starfish are. We can't get them anymore to dissect them. It was a very common dissection specimen for, maybe you guys did it in high school, but we can't get them anymore. They actually have something called starfish wasting disease, which we're not real sure what's causing this. But essentially what happens is their arms crawl away from one another. You guys know that starfish can regrow an arm if they lose it, right? Once again, very evolutionarily simple. But starfish wasting disease, it causes all 5 of their arms to crawl away at one time. And then it kills them. Make sense? So we don't really know why it's doing that, but their numbers are dropping drastically across the world. All the species of starfish. Makes sense because of this. Cool? But we're not real sure why. Sea urchins have them as well. That armored body, echinoderm, hence the name, those big armored spikes. Their tube feet sit underneath, and they can also poke them out from the top as well. If you guys have ever seen them get spikier and get not so spiky, that's what they're doing. They're poking their tube feet in not to get spikier. Sand dollar is basically a sea star, but round. Makes sense? Little feet on the bottom. They're not fish, so technically that's not a starfish. They're not fish. They don't have gills, nothing like that. So there is a professor on campus, not me, who will fuss at you if you call them starfish in his class. It's not me. So, cool. Makes sense on these? Pretty cool. You guys kind of understand where we started at with the bottom, with no body tissues, very simple, just kind of blows in a big blob. And now we're up at nice little fancy, nice little body organized with nice little tube feet and a water vascular system, full reproductive tracts, nice little mouth and anus on top of the sides and separated out. All of our body cavities are separated versus a big old cell that does everything. So we've made a nice little progression. We're done. We made a nice little progression up our evolutionary ladder, right? Cool. Any questions on this stuff, guys? Hopefully it was slightly interesting and worth an hour and a half. All right. So that's basically all I got for you. Next week, we shall knock out our chordates, and then we'll dissect the frog. Cool deal? All right, so we'll talk about what a chordate is. First off, do you guys know what chordates are? Chordates, things with backbones. So kind of rattle some thoughts about what you guys might think a chordate, what classifies a chordate, things with a backbone. It's not necessarily just a backbone. Makes sense? Because having a backbone doesn't make you a chordate. Part of it does, but not always. So think about some other things that you might consider a chordate could be in when you get back. Cool? That's basically all I got for y'all. Cool? Turn in anything you want to. I can pull out the real specimens if y'all want to look at some actual sponges and things like that if you want to, but I assume you guys have seen quite a few of those probably before in your life. Alright, so that's basically all I got, y'all. Don't forget your lecture exam is this week. Okay, so if you haven't taken it yet, it's due by Sunday, so don't forget that this week. I think it's 40 questions or something. Anybody taken it yet? I think it's like 40 questions or something. It's not too bad. If you guys have any questions about anything, please feel free to email me or talk to me while we're here. I'm more than happy to help and probably want to help you more than you think. Okay?
In my pre-K classroom, we do a whole unit on worms, and we're about to start ocean animals, and then we do like a life cycle of a butterfly, and you're like, why are you throwing this at me? But because I learned it.
Because I learned it all.
Because I learned it.
Oh, I love the butterfly. I think it's really tough. I love that.
Yeah, and they think the word pupa is hilarious.
The pupa, I can see that. I can see that.
It's a pupa. They're like, no, it's a cocoon. I'm like, it's called a pupa. And they're like, what?
That's pretty funny. See ya.
See ya.
See ya. You doing okay?
Yes, sir.
Awesome, awesome. I'll see you next week.
Yes, sir. Have a good one.
You too. Take it easy.